What if one morning the world woke up to find that the US dollar had collapsed? Today, the dollar is more than just a currency. It is the backbone of global trade, the reference point for international contracts, the safe haven for governments, businesses, and investors around the world. Oil, gold, technology, practically everything moves through the strength of the dollar. But what if that strength suddenly vanished? In this video, we're going to explore what the death of the dollar would actually mean. We'll look at how the dollar became the king of currencies, what could bring it down, and what the world would look like the day after its collapse. This isn't science fiction. History shows us that every empire believed its currency would last forever, until it didn't. And the collapse always came faster than expected. To understand the possible death of the dollar, we first need to understand how it became king. After World War II, the world was devastated, and the United States emerged as the dominant economic power. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement established that global trade would be anchored to the US dollar, which in turn was backed by gold. From that moment on, the dollar became the world's reserve currency. Even when the gold standard ended in 1971, the dollar kept its supremacy. Why? Because of trust. Trust in the US economy, trust in its institutions, and above all, trust in its military and political power. Over the decades, oil-producing countries began selling oil exclusively in dollars, strengthening what became known as the petrodollar. Multinational companies, banks, and governments around the world adopted the dollar as their safe currency. From the 1980s onward, every major crisis only reinforced the same reflex. When there's fear, people run to the dollar. Whether in a stock market crash, a war, or a pandemic, the dollar has always been seen as a safe haven. But history shows us that no empire lasts forever. The Roman denarius, the Spanish silver coin, and the British pound were once global currencies, until the empires that supported them collapsed. If the dollar seems so invincible, why talk about its collapse? In recent decades, warning signs have been growing. First, the explosion of U.S. debt. The United States owes more than $30 trillion, and this number keeps rising. The more the government prints money to cover deficits, the weaker global trust becomes. Second, the rise of China. With the world's second-largest economy, China has been pushing for greater use of the yuan in international trade. More and more countries are signing deals to bypass the dollar. Third, the advent of cryptocurrencies and digital assets. Bitcoin and other decentralized technologies challenge the monopoly of central banks, offering an alternative that many see as safer in the long term. Finally, the geopolitical factor. Economic sanctions used by the U.S. against rivals like Russia and Iran have accelerated the search for alternatives. Countries fear becoming hostages to the dollar system. Each of these signs on its own would not be enough to dethrone the dollar. But together they form cracks in the foundation of what we thought was unshakable. Imagine waking up to a normal morning. You turn on the TV and the news is everywhere. The dollar crashes in international markets. What once seemed impossible has just happened. The whole world panics. Stock markets record historic drops. American companies lose billions within minutes. Investors rush to exchange dollars for gold, cryptocurrencies, and even food. What was once considered the safest asset on earth is now seen as worthless paper. In U.S. supermarkets, shelves are emptied in hours. People line up desperately to spend what's left of their cash before it becomes worthless. The same happens in other countries that rely on dollars for imports. Instant inflation, chaos, and shortages. Governments hold emergency meetings, trying to create alternatives. Some nations announce new digital currencies backed by commodities, while others rush to adopt the yuan or euro. International trade freezes, ships stuck at ports, contracts suspended, planes grounded. The planet feels the shock of losing its financial anchor overnight. And perhaps most terrifying, the loss of trust doesn't just hit the U.S., it spreads globally. Banks collapse, investment funds vanish, and millions of people see their life savings evaporate in a single night. The day the dollar dies wouldn't be just an American problem. It would be a global catastrophe, comparable to a world war, but fought in financial markets and in the wallets of ordinary people. When we talk about the collapse of the dollar, it's easy to think only of numbers and charts, but the real impact would be felt in homes, families, and the daily lives of billions of people. In the United States, hyperinflation would eat away at salaries in days. What once filled a shopping cart would now barely buy a few essentials. Rents would skyrocket, loans would become unpayable, and millions would fall into poverty. In Latin America, where economies depend heavily on the dollar, the crisis would be even harsher. Countries importing food, fuel, and technology in dollars would see prices multiply overnight. For families, this would mean scarcity, endless lines, and local currencies collapsing to record lows. In Europe and Asia, financial markets would suffer cascading bank failures. Pension funds, international reserves, and investments tied to the dollar would evaporate. Retirees, workers, and ordinary people saving for the future would be devastated. In poorer countries, the impact would be brutal. International aid, usually calculated in dollars, would lose value. Humanitarian programs would be interrupted. Hospitals, schools, and even energy supplies could stop due to lack of resources. In the end, the message would be clear. The dollar may look invincible, but when it falls, its crash will shake every corner of the planet. If the dollar stopped being the global reference currency, the inevitable question would be, what comes next? The first obvious option would be the euro. Europe has a strong economy and stable institutions, but political fragmentation and crises, from Brexit to war in Ukraine, undermine confidence in its strength. Another alternative is the Chinese yuan. China has worked tirelessly to internationalize its currency, closing billion-dollar deals in energy, infrastructure, and technology. But there's a big obstacle: lack of transparency and trust in its government policies. Many nations hesitate to rely fully on Beijing. Some argue for a basket of currencies, managed by multilateral institutions. Instead of relying on one nation, it would be a balanced mix: euro, yuan, pound, maybe even emerging market currencies. This would reduce risk, but create enormous complexity. And then there are digital currencies: Bitcoin, other cryptocurrencies, or central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. They offer speed, decentralization, and in some cases transparency. But volatility, regulation, and resistance from traditional governments remain challenges. In every case, one thing is certain: replacing the dollar wouldn't be easy. It's deeply embedded in contracts, reserves, and systems worldwide. The transition would be slow, chaotic, and uncertain. But if the dollar dies, the world will have no choice but to build a new monetary order. History teaches us that no currency is eternal. The Roman denarius, the British pound, both were once dominant, and both fell with their empires. Today, the US dollar stands at the top, but nothing lasts forever. The day the dollar dies, whether in a decade or a century, will mark a turning point. Not only in economics, but in how power and global relations are shaped. Those who are prepared will survive the storm. Those who are not will feel the weight of every consequence. So how do you prepare? There's no simple answer, but some paths are clear. Diversify investments, avoid reliance on a single currency, and consider real assets such as gold, land, or decentralized technologies. The worst mistake would be believing the current system is unshakable. Maybe the most important lesson isn't predicting the exact day the dollar collapses, but recognizing that it can collapse, and ignoring this possibility could be fatal. The dollar may be the pillar of today's world economy, but even the strongest pillars eventually crack. The question isn't if the dollar will fall, but when. And when that day comes, the world will be forced to live under a new economic order, a world after the dollar.